If you want to build an online business of any sort, you know just how important content creation is. After all, content is how you're going to grow your audience and nurture your relationship with that audience. All the things that are eventually going to lead to you making sales. However, for most of us, content creation can feel incredibly overwhelming and time-consuming, which is why in today's video, I'm going to give you 6 tips to help you create content quickly and easily. These are the tips that help me go from needing 3 hours to write a single email, 1 hour to prepare for a 10-minute video, another hour to write a social media post, to being able to quickly and consistently create content every single day, most of the time in 30 minutes or often way less. Welcome. If you're new here, I'm Luisa Zhou, and this channel is all about helping you build your own online business and succeed as an entrepreneur. To be notified when I drop a new video each week, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. All right, let's get right into the 6 tips. Tip number 1 is to not wait for inspiration, but to instead take it. A huge part of why it used to take me so long to create a single piece of content was that I would be sitting in front of my computer thinking, okay, what can I talk about today? Waiting for that inspiration to strike. As you might have experienced already, if you're waiting for inspiration to strike, you might be waiting for quite a while. Nowadays, I take inspiration from anything and everything going on in my life. No single thing is too big or too small. For example, recently I've been wanting to try a new baking project, and yesterday I got the press molds for the mini cakes that I want to make. I was so excited when I got the molds that I took a picture and shared them on my Instagram stories to let my audience know a fun behind the scenes of something I'm doing. If I wanted to use it as inspiration for an email, I would share the story of how I got the mold and why I was interested in trying that baking experiment, and then potentially tie that into a business tip on trying new things in your business. Note that I'm also using it as a teaching example in this video for you. That's just one example of how you can use the smallest thing as inspiration for many pieces of content. And you can do this no matter how small or how large the event. And as a bonus, because you're always going to be living your life and having things happen, when you take inspiration from your life this way, you're never going to run out of content ideas. Tip number 2 is to answer this one important question before any piece of content that you create. That question is, what is the point? In other words, what's the takeaway that you want someone to have from that piece of content? For example, in this video, I want to make sure you walk away with some great tips for creating content quickly and easily. Maybe in a social media post, I want to leave someone feeling inspired and motivated. Or maybe in an email, I want to leave my readers with a powerful mindset reframe to help them grow their business better. Whatever that one takeaway is, you want to get clear on that before you start any content creation. Otherwise, you could be spending a lot of time writing a story or some tips and wondering, okay, where am I going with this? On the other hand, when you know what the takeaway of that piece of content is from the beginning, it's a lot easier to structure how you're creating that content. Speaking of structure, that brings me to tip number 3, which is to use the same structure for every single piece of content that you create. The structure you want to use is this. First, start with an attention-grabbing introduction. That can be a fun story, image, quote, or really anything that grabs your audience's attention and gets them to stop and think, oh, this is something I could be interested in. The second part of your structure is the actual meat of your content, where you're teaching whatever it is that you want to share. There are a few common ways to format the middle section. One way is to do as I'm doing in this video and share via a series of tips. That helps you break out your content into bite-sized pieces that are easy for you to teach and easy for your audience to consume. Another common format is a step-by-step structure, where you're essentially saying, hey, do this for step 1, do this for step 2, and so on. And finally, if you don't have a series of tips or a series of steps, what you can do is elaborate on one example or one story that leads into one powerful takeaway. The final part of the structure is the conclusion. This is where you want to summarize what you just shared and most likely leave your audience with some sort of call to action. That can look like an invite to leave a comment, like your post, hit subscribe, hit reply, click to something, or buy something. Once you know the structure to follow for every piece of content, it's a lot easier to fill in the structure than to have to create it from scratch every time. Tip number 4 is to make it a habit, so that essentially what you're doing is training your brain to get inspired to create content on command. This is actually advice that the top writers in the world often give. I'm thinking of, for example, Stephen King, who sets himself a quota of 2,000 words to write every single day. Another example is Dan Kennedy, who's considered one of the top copywriters in the world. His daily habit is first thing in the morning, he goes to his desk, he sits down, and he writes for at least an hour. Over the past few years, I've trained myself to develop that habit as well. The first thing I do every morning is to create a piece of content, whether that's to write an email, a social media post, or record a video like this. Now, I'm not as consistent as Stephen King or Dan Kennedy, but I do notice that when I take some time off of this habit and come back to it, it usually takes me 2 or 3 days before it starts feeling natural again. Notice that I said that this is a habit that takes time to build. It did not come naturally to me in the beginning. What I recommend doing is setting aside a specific time and place to create content at least once or twice a week so that you can start developing this habit without having it feeling too overwhelming. Tip number 5 is possibly the most effective tip, but also potentially the hardest to implement. And that tip is to give yourself a time limit when you're creating your content. Another one of the reasons that it used to take me so long to create a piece of content is that I would sit down, I wouldn't give myself a time limit, and then I would say, okay, however long it takes for me to get inspiration to write this piece of content, it is what it is. Unless you want to be spending 3 hours or more writing every single email like I used to do, that is not something that I would recommend. Now, you might be thinking that you are not a fast or natural writer, so it's really hard to set a time limit, and I want you to know I used to think that too. I mean, come on, this is coming from someone who used to take 3 hours to create a piece of content. So here's what I did. I first set a time limit that felt quite generous to me of about 45 minutes. I would sit down, tell myself, you only have 45 minutes to do this, set the timer, and then whatever I had at the end of 45 minutes would be it. The first few times I did this, I would scramble to finish towards the end of the 45-minute mark, and often I wasn't that satisfied with the content I created. However, it was good enough, and so I forced myself to publish it and move on. Doing that for a few times helped me get really comfortable with having a time limit. So gradually, I was able to finish actually before the timer expired. Once I started doing that a few times in a row, I shortened the length of the timer. So I would move it to, let's say, 40 minutes. Once that happened again, I would move it to 35 minutes and 30 minutes and so on. And that's how gradually over, I would say about a few months, I was able to get my creation time for each piece of content down to 30 minutes or often much less. The final tip I have for you is a really fun one, and it is to talk it out. Whatever it is that you're creating, speak it as you write it. Now, here's the thing. You don't want to just speak it. You want to speak it as if you are creating that piece of content for a friend. Here's why that's so important. If you started out with a job in the corporate world, as I did, you were probably taught to speak and write in a certain way, aka really professionally. Even nowadays, whenever I sit down to create a piece of content, sometimes I still get into my head about putting on that professional persona. When you do though, you start overthinking, oh my gosh, am I sounding professional enough? And frankly, you don't sound like yourself because you kind of sound like a professional robot. So my trick for getting out of that headspace is to, before I create any piece of content, spend a few seconds visualizing an imaginary conversation with a really good friend. It can look really weird. I'll just be standing there talking to nobody for a few seconds and smiling and seeming like a crazy person. But what that does is it relaxes you. It gets you out of that persona and it gets you flowing with your natural voice and style. Then, as you create your content, you continue to speak to that friend and you simply type out or record whatever it is that you're saying to that friend. This way, you don't get caught up in going back over each phrase thinking, is it good enough? Is it professional enough? Which can be incredibly time consuming. It forces you to continue moving forward with your content creation and get it done so much faster. When I started doing this, I realized I was spending more than half my time rereading every single sentence that I was writing, going back, rewriting it, and then rewriting it again. So this will eliminate a lot of time spent doing that and have your content coming out sounding natural and like you on the very first try. And those are my 6 tips. If you found this helpful, I've got another great video for you also on helping you be even more productive in your business. It's my tips for how I built a 6-figure business on the side while working a really busy 9-to-5. You're gonna see that somewhere on the screen and or in the description below, so go ahead and check that out if you're interested. If you're wanting to build your own 6-figure online coaching business, I've also got a great free PDF for you on the blueprint to follow to do that. So again, if you want that, that's gonna be somewhere on this screen and or in the description below. Finally, if you found this video helpful and you like my style, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and the bell to be notified every single week when I drop a new video on building your own online business and succeeding as an entrepreneur. That is it for today. Thanks so much for being here, and I will see you next time.